Hey, welcome back to another video, guys. So today we're going over DNS. We did a DHCP video previously, so I thought it was only natural to do a DNS video because these are, two of the most common things to learn in the tech industry and probably two of the most useful things to know, especially starting out. I'm sure you've heard of turn it off and back on again as a solution to IT, pretty much as a complete joke, even though that is very legit. The next thing after that is always check DNS because it's always DNS. It's always a DNS problem. So today we're going to jump into how DNS works, maybe how to troubleshoot it, and some real practical applications of utilizing DNS to find things out. Now, the very first thing is, what is DNS? DNS stands for Domain Name System, and Google describes it as a phone book of the internet. Of course, that's pretty accurate. But to explain further, all it does is take the IP address and translates them into a host name or a website. For example, google.com has its IP address associated to it, and you know it as google.com, but the internet technically knows it as an IP address. For an example, if we pinged google.com, it would return a IP address for us, and that applies to computer names, host names, and all websites. Now, at the very top level of DNS is called the root level. And what the root level is basically storing information about .com. And what .com represents is called the top level domain. And top level domains would be like .org, .com, .net, .whatever. And then the second level on top of that will be the Google portion. So it'll be google.com. So this would be your second level. This is your top level domain. And the last category is subdomains. And subdomains is pretty much everything in front of google.com. For example, google.com is here. If you were to go to photos.google.com, that would return something else. And that would be their subdomain, photos. Now, one of the cool things you can do is actually take this IP address and copy it and open up a browser and just type it into your browser, and it'll actually take you right to the web portal that the IP address is associated to. And that is pretty much what DNS is doing. So if you need to see how to actually configure DNS, please check out one of my other videos. But let's assume that we already have a DNS role. If you didn't know already, if you go to add roles and features and go through this menu and add DNS, you can do it that way. To show you guys DNS, we can just go over to Tools and then DNS, drop down for forward lookup zones and hit your domain name. Here you can see a list of the computer's host names. And the only thing we're really going to talk about today is an A record. And what an A record is pretty much what we just talked about, which is mapping an IP address to a host name. So you can see that this address is associated to DC01. This address is associated to Goku. And Goku is my Windows 10 box. And as you'll notice, DC01 is actually set to a static. If you right click and create a new host A record, you can create a static address, which means that this domain name, or rather this host name, will always be associated with this exact address. For Goku, this is not static, it's getting its address through DHCP. And since it's not static inside of the DNS server, what will happen is if this address ever changes, it'll pick up the new one and make sure that the IP address is always the correct one associated to the host name. So if we head over to my Windows 10 box Goku and open up command prompt, there's a few things that we can see here. The first thing is if we ping that host name DC01, what we get is its IP address, and that's DNS at work. We can also do an NS lookup of DC01, and it will tell you what server that our computer is looking at to find DC01. And the server that it's currently looking at for our DNS, which is here, is just the old name of DC01 that just needs to update, which will take a little bit of time. If you're unaware of what NS lookup is, I did make a little bit more of a detailed video if you wanted to check that out too. Now, what you do want to keep in mind is if your computer is not joined to the domain, it's not going to be in your DNS server. As an example, I can show you what it looks like if I was to try to ping DC01 on my home computer rather than one that's already on my domain. And it's just picking up the MAC address because it's local. But for example, if I did it at NS lookup, it's looking at Google as my DNS server and it has no idea what DC01 is. And that's mostly just because it's its own server in my private network. So this is pretty much it for my explanation on how DNS servers are actually configured. Now, a really good troubleshooting tip would actually be the way that you use DNS to figure out if there is an issue with either your DNS server or the IP address or the way that a computer is actually communicating with other computers in the network. DNS can always lead you to a solution. And what I mean by this is just if you go to ping a host name like DC011, which does not exist at all, it's not going to be able to give you any IP address. But if DC011 actually existed and it still returns that it cannot find it, that just totally leads to a DNS problem and how your computer on your network is trying to communicate with your DNS server and where the issue could be there. A lot of times your DNS might not be set correctly, which you can check by doing the ipconfig/all command and just double check that your DNS server is the correct one. On top of that, there could be an issue with your DNS host records, which you can double check on our server like we saw before. And all of your records should be matching your IP address. So if you're troubleshooting a specific computer, these are the two places that you would look, is your server DNS records. Make sure they're matching up correctly. Make sure you don't have any duplicates there. And of course, double check your computer's DNS server that you're actually troubleshooting from. Another reason that a computer might not be communicating properly is if it isn't joined to your domain controller, or maybe it fell off your domain. And in that case, you would just need to make sure to rejoin it to the domain. And by doing so, it'll basically just re-register the computer. And to do that, you would just go into your system settings, go into advanced system properties, and you will be able to hit this change button here, and you can join it to the work group and then rejoin it back to your domain. And that'll make sure that the computer is joined to the domain correctly, which is really important. It happens every now and then, especially if a computer hasn't been on the network for a long time, like it's been turned off and forgotten about. Policy would just end up dropping it off the domain, so it needs to be rejoined. This also happens a lot for virtual machines. Often when you recover from a snapshot, it'll actually corrupt the domain joined device, and you will need to rejoin it yourself. So that's a very common scenario to do this. And that's really all I've got for DNS right now. There is tons more to do, things like MX records or CNAME records, but I'll leave that for another video because it is a ton to go over. So I hope this built a pretty good foundation for you and let you understand how DNS is actually working. Please like, subscribe, and comment below if you guys enjoyed the video, and stay tuned for more.